This is the Coming Home Podcast with John Allen. 3, 2, 1, and welcome everybody to this episode of the Coming Home Podcast with John Allen. And today I have Jeff Hogue, part 2.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome back.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me back.
You know, I'm looking at you. You've got a hoodie on in California. What's the temperature out there now?
It's a little cold. It's like, what is it? Like 50 something. Let me check my phone. I know most people would laugh at that, but
a little chilly. He said, "Hey, Norway." He said a little chilly.
Yeah, well, actually, it's 46 now, which is 46. I know nothing in comparison to what's going on in Norway or most parts of the U.S. right now. So.
Yeah, you can have your hoodie, man. You can wear your hoodie. You are in the city of Los Angeles, right? No, you're outside.
No. Yeah, I'm outside of Los Angeles. I'm in Trabuco Hills area, so I'm like just a little south. I'm just right on the border of Irvine.
Okay.
So technically, I live in Lake Forest, but our area used to be called Trabuco Canyon, and then we got incorporated into Lake Forest. So
swallowed up by the urban sprawl.
Yeah. I guess you could say that.
And what's going on out there in California? Is it really this mass exodus of people? I'm hearing so many. I was listening to Joe Rogan's podcast. I've heard Bill Burr mention this, that people are just leaving California in droves. Are they exaggerating, or is there an element of truth to that?
Yeah, there is an element of truth to that. I think it's sometimes a little hyped, but there is definitely an element of people that are leaving. There's a couple kind of like push factors for that. The one is the pricing. The prices are out of control, especially in like the Northern California around the Bay. They're really expensive. And here it's expensive as well, but not as, I think, drastic as Northern California.
But it's bad enough from what I understand. You know, I've been looking into house flipping and investment in real estate and whatnot. And California is just, I mean, you just kind of, if you're looking to get into that kind of investment, you kind of have to just wipe away any examples from California because it's so much more expensive than the rest of the country. It's not a realistic view of what it's like to get into the real estate market.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, 'cause we have a home, myself and my wife, we have a home here, and then we have a condo that we rent out. But moving forward, we're not, because we were thinking about buying more property, but yeah, we're not looking at California because it's so much. Like, unless we hit the lotto or you're a multimillionaire, that's when you can kind of start playing in that market. But for the most part, you know, I think even upper middle class people, I consider myself, you know, upper middle class or maybe the first rung of what you would consider rich. I don't like to say that, but that's I guess where I am.
Come on, man, say it and be proud.
according, I should be prouder than I am, but according to, you know, the IRS and the government. But the taxes are rough, and especially, you know, because Trump changed the tax code, the way that you could use your house. Right, so taxes actually got higher for a lot more people in California, and because like I remember last year was like the first time, because we changed the code in like 17, so it was like 18 or 19 was actually maybe twice in a row where I've had to pay more in federal, because like I got refunds from the state of California, but I had to pay more in federal taxes at the end of the year.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, because a lot of Trump support, and this is not going to be a bash Trump episode, but let's bash him for a second here, because you hear so much, or we heard so much about this being a tax-friendly, or Trump's time period as president was a tax-friendly period for the average person. But you're saying, at least in California, it was not. You paid more federal taxes. Yeah.
So the thing is, the way that when they pushed through his tax cuts through Congress, the way that they structured, which is a part of why a lot of, I mean, this was like a minor note, but a lot of the criticism at the time was, hey, the way that you're structuring this new tax bill, people in blue states, because some of the tax credits that they removed primarily affected people in blue states. And the Republicans at the time who controlled both the House and the Senate were, who cares? The people in blue states are not our voters.
Do you think they did that consciously?
I think they did, because the thing is,
I do
they
too.
didn't want to. They didn't want to blow up the debt too much, right? So they're like, well, somebody has to pay for it.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, we'll get the people in the blue states to pay for it.
I believe that. I believe that. I believe it was a top-down thing in the Trump administration, that they truly had this idea of, he wasn't America's president. He was your president if you liked him, if you followed him, if you were a Republican, then he was your president. And I don't believe that that's me. That's not necessarily how I looked at him as a president, but I think that is his way of thinking. I put that on him.
Well, I think it's not just him. I think the thing is, to me, it's not just him. Unfortunately, that's a common thing now in the Republican Party, which actually even and I don't want to get too far.
Well, basically, I'm saying he didn't give a shit about you if you were not a Republican. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
basically.
That's definitely true. But I think it's not like a conspiracy theory or anything like that.
No.
Believe that. I mean, that's what he was saying. That's what these guys were saying.
Yes, exactly.
Like,
yeah. And again, I don't think there's no conspiracy theory, and it's not conjecture. I'm just looking at the facts. I'm hearing his own words in his own words. Yeah.
This is what these guys had said. They were like, well, they really don't. I think they don't consider, blue states America. Like they talk about, blue state bailouts, and it's like, dude, what happened? I thought we were the United States of America,
right?
Not like the red states of America. But there's this thing, like, well, we don't care. Even when the virus started, right, and it was California and New York that were mainly affected, they were like, well, why should our people pay money into the kitty to help people in these states? And
it was pretty disgusting. It was pretty disgusting. People were almost like, screw those people on the coast, let them die. They were laughing. They were literally laughing at you guys.
Yeah, and it's like, well, if communist China had rolled up on the West Coast, or September 11th when we got attacked in New York City, nobody said which to me it really bothered me, because when that happened on September 11th, because I was 18 at the time. Yeah, I think it was around 18 years old. Like when that happened, a lot of people, there was no Republican stood up and said like, well, that's a blue state issue. Like I don't got voters in Manhattan, right?
Yeah.
Nobody said that. Nobody that did not cross anyone's mind. Everyone was like, dude, we've been attacked as the United States of America, and we need to pull together, and this is what we have to do right now. And in the face of a pandemic, Trump is his own character, but I was shaken by what a lot of people in Congress were saying, because, I at least expected better from them. Like, hey, this is a serious problem. It's not in my state. And that's the other thing that was weird to me during this whole process is like, naturally it's going to spread, man. It's not going to just stay in New York City. It's not just like a liberal disease that we got going on here.
Well, I remember when it was getting
marks as well, right?
Yeah. I remember when it was getting bad in the Pacific Northwest, up in Northern California, Oregon, and especially Washington State. And to hear a conservative talk about COVID at that time, it's like, this is a cancer upon these hippie Democrats on the West Coast, and good luck, guys. And that was kind of the attitude of the whole thing. And it's like that is so far from the concept of what America is supposed to be like. It was for me. It was jaw dropping, and for me to be an expat, looking at this from a distance, it hurt me to my soul to see people. Maybe I was naive, and it just, but the reality of that division in America, it just really hit me right in the forehead.
Yeah, I think unfortunately right now there's a lot of resentment between people in the red states and people in the blue states. I think it's there, and it's not just. I will also say it's not just a red state issue. I think there's a lot of resentment from the people in the blue states towards people in the red states as well. I think it's a different type of resentment.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the people in the red states have been hurt economically for decades, right? They haven't had the same type of investment. They haven't had the same type of opportunity. And I think they're looked down upon, and they can feel that. And they obviously, so those feelings of, we haven't had anybody really, I think, and people are going to be upset that I'm saying this, but I think Obama tried to address some of these issues, because Obama, everyone forgets, but he actually got overwhelming support in 2008, and even to a certain extent in 2012 when he got reelected. I mean, he won he won the Iowa primary.
Like, yeah, imagine.
Iowa is 95% white, right?
Yeah, think about it.
So I don't think it was, in the beginning, it wasn't necessarily a race issue in the beginning. To a certain extent, I think there were elements that were starting there.
Well, I think there's certainly there's certainly a demographic of the Republican Party who took advantage of those people who did resent Obama because of his race. I mean, we're seeing their descendants, if we can use that word, today in this Trump base. Yeah. Isn't it weird that there's still a Trump base? The guy is gone. He's been impeached. He may be convicted. And there's still a base. There's still a Trump base. Isn't that weird?
Well, actually, to me, that makes a lot of sense because I think we can all agree that Trump's not a normal president, right? No. And a lot of his so there were elements for a long time in the Republican Party on the fringes, right? People racists, people who were nativist, ethnocentrists. A lot of these, I'd say, bad actors, militias, if you will, they were never, they voted Republican. They were associated, just like, on the left, you have, and I don't want to just I'm not doing a one side or the other, but also on the left, you have people who are extremists. You have environmental terrorists. You have literal communists, other people who are on the far left who, they're okay with Antifa using violence, but they vote Democrat, right? It's the same thing. But for a long time, the Republican Party, they didn't let the crazies run the party, right?
Right.
And they said what they needed to say to keep those people at the distance. I mean, obviously, even Ronald Reagan, was just one of the biggest Republican conservatives up until Trump, I think, because the party was really molded by him. Before Trump, even he went on national TV and said, I don't have anything to do with the Klan. I hate the Klan. They're horrible. It was really black and white. Whereas, Trump, it took 2 or 3 iterations of him on camera to denounce them, right? Yeah. And, obviously with Charlottesville. And the thing is, like, those types of people embraced him. And I think the thing is, too, the demographics of the country have changed. And Trump is feeding off of grievance politics, right? That going back to what we talked about earlier, these people are hurting. They don't see a way out. They think that other people are getting things that they're not getting. They don't think they're getting a fair shake. And some of that's true. There's some legitimate, things in there. And he's using that to fuel his movement. And I think a lot of people, as sad as it is, unfortunately have kind of given up on America. You hear people say things like, well, America's broken. Well, this isn't working, right? And it's like, well, what is... And I love to ask those people, like, well, what is your alternative, right? Yeah. Because people, they want simple answers to complex problems, and those simple answers sometimes will get you even more problems or issues than, it's like something bad happens in your life. You're facing financial ruin, right? You're in a lot of pain. This is the way I kind of tend to think about it. These people are in a lot of pain, horrible things that have happened to them. So they start using meth or some kind of other illicit drugs, or they start drinking because they're trying to get rid of the pain, right? Yeah. So in this case, that's these kinds of, QAnon crazy theories, white supremacy, whatever it is, right? They're looking for some kind of crutch to explain the situation and to give them a path out of whatever they're in, right?
Yeah. I see this.
That brings them to more problems, more issues, and the situation actually for them gets worse, right? And, that's what authoritarianism and, fascism generally leads to. I mean, if you look at Italy, you look at Germany, you look even imperialist Japan, like these countries were in hard places in the 30s or even in the 20s, and they had economic problems, and there was a guy or people who said, hey, I got a solution for you. We can make you strong again. Yeah. And that's why kick some ass, take some names.
And that's why the comparison. That's why the comparison between Trump and Mussolini or Trump and Hitler, I believe, is a very legitimate comparison because he did the exact same thing that those dictators did. I think the only difference is, and we should thank the good Lord for this, is that people say America is broken. People say it's not working, but it is working because the structure, the foundation of our democracy was challenged. And it was challenged in a very big and very direct way, but it held up. It held out. We're still here.
It did. Yeah, it did held up. It did held up. I mean, there were definitely some cracks in the system, but I think that there's some. We shouldn't rest assured because I think for one is one of the big difference between Hitler and the Nazis and Trump is I think that the Nazis were more sophisticated. They had a lot more sophisticated people.
Well, Trump. I'll say it straight up.
Hitler in general.
I'll say it straight up. Trump is an idiot. Trump is a dumbass, and that is why he did not succeed. That's why he didn't succeed in the end. I'll say it straight up. That's really the issue.
I wouldn't go that far because I wouldn't want to. I don't want to underestimate him. I think the problem with him is that he has a certain skill set, right?
He does.
That his skill set was the thing that he was really great with was the media.
Yeah,
and he did have great political insights into these grievances. And the other thing that was an advantage to him, which is that he had no bottom line, right? So for you or me or most other politicians, like, so for instance, in 2008 with John Kerry, right? Or not, I'm sorry, not John Kerry, John McCain. When John McCain ran, right, there was a woman, kind of famous now, who stood up, who tried to say, Barack Obama's, he's a Muslim. She started saying all this, right? And obviously, John McCain, even if you didn't like his economic policies, or somebody like Ronald Reagan, you didn't like his, you didn't agree with his standard philosophy, right, which was the philosophy of the Republican Party. A lot of Republicans were not going to tolerate any kind of this racism or anything else, right? I mean, and they, especially overt, I mean, you could say that certain things weren't right that they did policy-wise.
But the overt racism didn't exist at that point.
That wasn't going to happen.
Not in the top.
And,
not in the top of the party.
John McCain, when that woman came up, he was like, nope, stomp this out right now. We're not doing this. And he went over and said that Barack Obama was a great, I mean, you don't ever hear that. Right? In the middle of a campaign, that, you know what, my opponent's a great person, but he just doesn't, and that was, I mean, those were classic kind of conservative politics. And the thing is, like, that's why I don't like kind of referring to Trump supporters or Trump kind of politics as conservatives, because it's not really conservatism.
No.
And it's, because when we say that that's kind of conservatism to a certain degree, it kind of legitimizes that, because it's very different. Even if I was talking to a Trump supporter, I would say the same thing. Obviously, American politics and what the Republican Party has become is very different than what it was 10, 12 years ago.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because going back to Reagan, I was old enough, I'm 17, 18 years old in, let's say in 1980, 87, 88. I was 17, 18 years old. I was old enough to follow what was happening in politics. And there was not this element of accepting racism at the top of the Republican Party at that time, whereas now there is. And if we fast forward from the 80s under Reagan to the current time under Trump, would you say that the Democratic Party has dropped the ball? Because to go from Reagan to Trump, that's a long process, and there's been signs that things have been getting a little bit out of control, a little bit more racist, a little bit more fascist at the top of the Republican Party. And Democrats kind of let that happen. Why should the Republican Party be the party that at least appears to be there for the common man in America? I think the Democrats dropped the ball. They lost a great opportunity to be, a liberal-leaning party, even a quasi-socialist party, but they could have used that quasi-socialism to front their case in such a way that it would be appealing to that poor white Appalachian person, to that white factory worker who lost his job. I say the Democrats have really, really dropped the ball.
Yeah, I think there is some, I think a lot of things, I think there's a lot of elements went into us getting here. I think the Democratic Party also holds a certain responsibility from what you described, from the economic kind of standpoint. And I grew up in Buffalo, in the late 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, when factories were closing, people were losing their jobs, and this wasn't just like a Buffalo issue. Pittsburgh, all those states that ended up going for Trump, that's where that was all happening in the Rust Belt, right?
Northeast Ohio, Cleveland, Akron. Youngstown.
The whole Great Lakes area, right? And we were losing our manufacturing power, and because of globalization, and some guy on Wall Street and, people in the Hamptons and out here and the West Coast were making a lot of money, and their spreadsheet said that globalization looked great, right? And everyone was happy. Well, minus the people that were losing their jobs, but who cares about them, right? Yeah. And I think the Democratic Party made the decision that they were going to focus on like race and identity issues, right? And I know this is a standard kind of conservative trope, but I think there's definitely an element of truth in it.
Sure, there is. Sure.
Those types of things, right? Like, because from a political point of view, like making sure that African Americans aren't killed by the police, or those, talking about, they're important, right? Racial rights and everything else. I think they were like, this is easier for us to achieve these types of things than it is to change these broad economic factors, right, of what's happening in America. And by the way, we're also making money, and a lot of us are doing good as well, right? So we don't want to step. And of course, this is, socialism at this point had been discredited, right? Because the Soviet Union fell, everyone's making money. They don't we're not going to stand in the way of this, right? This seems like it's the future. Whereas we had to read in school, Francis Fukuyama, it's the end of history, right? Yeah. So they were like, this is just economics. This is just what's going to happen. And they didn't take care of these people. And now, because these people got crushed economically now for a couple of generations, they become embittered. They're looking for a new voice, right? And they become more extremist, because when you're hungry or you're desperate, right? And I think, I've been at a point, right after I graduated from college, we talked last time when I first moved out here, it was hard for me to find a job. I had to do anything, and I ended up, getting some low-level sales job, right? Yeah. Now, people, when you haven't eaten for a couple of days, or you don't have many prospects, and you got these people, and then the other thing is, obviously, we've been going through these kind of unfortunate culture wars. The Democrats, they didn't really come out with a message, and people on the left in general, they didn't come out with a message they didn't emphasize the importance of America, us coming together as one country. They kind of lost that, and they looked at, and there were legitimate problems with our history, right? They looked at issues, obviously, slavery, Jim Crow, all these other issues, right? Which there's a philosopher, I'm trying to remember his name. He talks about this a lot, but he talks about, in Plato's Republic, and I don't know how familiar people are with Plato's Republic. I know I'm going off on a deep end here in philosophy, but in Plato's Republic, they talk about the noble lie, right? You have to have some kind of, and for a long time, America had a noble lie that, we were this free society, and that everyone was trying to work together, and that, liberty and justice for all. And of course, that, if you look at the details, that's not exactly how the system played off. Exactly. But we at least we gave it rhetoric, and we were trying to live up to it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people on the left exposed a lot of that. They blew a lot of that up. But the consequences of that was, well, if we don't have all that in common, then what do we have? Right. So then the question is, how do you pull everyone back together to kind of work as a team? Because when you, so for instance, people,
do you think Joe Biden is doing that? Is Joe Biden pulling us together? He certainly has a different, just the way he's speaking to us on a daily basis, and what he is saying and how he is saying it. Do you think that is the beginning of a new American unity?
I think it's a step in the right direction. I will have to see how it
will it last?
Will it last? I think, but the thing is, though, I think we're not going to get out of this in 2 or 3 years or 4 years. I think the Republican Party has ceased to exist for all practical purposes. What we have now, there's elements that are left that are trying to do the right thing, that are trying to bring that party back from the abyss. But I think it's more or less it's a cult of personality around one man.
Oh,
and I don't
absolutely.
think I'm being hyperbolic in saying
I don't
that.
think so either.
Marjorie Greene, a member of Congress, stood out there and said, this is Donald Trump's party. And, you have, I'd say, at least 30 to 40% of the population that believes that the election has been stolen, and that they have bought into this philosophy or philosophies. And it's going to take a long time to get us back to where we were and rebuild those bridges. And I think that, unfortunately, it's going to fall upon the Democratic Party to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and they're going to have to be a more center of the road, even center right. And I know many people on the left are going to hate what I'm going to say. They're going to have to be more of a center right party, because they're going to have people in there from the center right.
Yes.
Because you don't have those people. The danger now is if you don't have people from the center right and they are going to be a vote for you in the party, we're going to lose control, and we're going to lose to these people again.
Here's what I think may be happening. Unless the Democratic Party opens its eyes and opens its arms also to embrace some of these people who are former Republicans or current Republicans who are dissatisfied with the remnants of the Republican Party. If the Democrat Party vocalizes its message properly, they can bring these people in. They can welcome these people into the fold, into the Democratic Party, and there can be an even greater majority. They have the majority in Congress. Big question mark whether or not that majority will continue at the next midterm election. They're hanging on by a very thin thread. Thank goodness we have a Democratic president and vice president, so that they have this let's call it a majority in the Senate. But it's too close for comfort. I would not label myself a Democrat, but I am certainly. I am light years away from the Republican Party's way of doing politics. I'm quite close to the Democratic way of doing politics in America. I think people like me, we're waiting. We want to see, what is the Democratic Party going to do? Are they going to drop the ball again like they did over the last 15, 20 years? And they're I think they stand to lose a lot of credibility based upon what they do and don't do just over the next year. Let's say up until the next midterm election. They stand to lose a lot of credibility.
Yeah, I think I think they have a very hard task in front of them. And I think, like we said, bringing in these white voters who've been disenfranchised. And, that's the thing is, too, I mean, the white population in the United States, I'm sorry, when my battery's running low for some reason. Let me grab a cord real quick.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Should grab a power cord. The white population in the United States still makes up over 60%, right? So they're going to have to do something about that. They can't just say that, let that go without some kind of, they have to address those people. And many of those people were Obama voters in 2008 and 2012. I know a couple, matter of fact, former Democrats who were Obama voters who are now like big time Trump supporters. Who are saying all kinds of crazy stuff online, right? Who are hardcore, Trump supporters. And, it's scary because I'm like, what happened to you, right? Where I'm like, I remember when you were voting for Obama and you were telling me, because I myself was a Republican for a long time, and now I don't associate anything whatsoever with that party. And I'm just like, to me, it's become very, very authoritarian. And I'm like, this isn't, it's anti-democratic.
Well, I think it's frightening. It's not just, they're not just a little off. They're not just a little crazy. It's batshit crazy, frightening. It's terrifying that there's people like that at the top of our government. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, when they, these people are, storming the Capitol, they're carrying giant flags. I mean, we've never in America had, I'm going to go out and buy swag with the guy's name across it. I mean, a little bit here and there. You might see some people, but even with those people, it was like more of a joke, right?
Yeah.
Like you didn't see people like with a full-on Nixon, outfit or even Obama. And like even around here in Orange County, I remember before the election, there were all these little stands around that they would just be selling Trump merchandise. Right, shirts and flags and everything else, and a lot of this stuff. And the thing is, too, I study a lot about fascism and Nazism and authoritarian regimes and how they operate and how they think, and the parallels were just scary because, especially, I mean, we talk about authoritarian government, or especially, I should say, not necessarily authoritarian per se, but fascism is very much based on ideas around romanticism and grievance, and you have this belief that there was at one point this utopian society and somehow we fell or we were stabbed in the back, we were betrayed, and these kinds of ideas are so like they're just percolating all over the Republican Party right now, or the remnants of said party. And I think many of the original Republicans were chased out. You had all these people kind of that were across the country, and Donald Trump just started to this foghorn that he just kept on loosing. Yeah. And these people had these grievances, and they came together, and it was like he has these rallies. Like it's the 30s, right? Well,
I call him an idiot. I call him an idiot and a bonehead and all this stuff, but he does have some sort of primal savvy where he knows.
I think I might have lost you. I think I might have to call you back. I can't hear your sound.
You can't hear me. That's not good. Let's try this again. I'll call you back. Huh. You hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I lost you there for a moment.
There we go.
I don't know what happened.
Okay. What was I saying? Yeah, I called Trump a pinhead and an idiot and this, that, and the other, but he does have a certain amount of savvy. He knows what to say and how to say it in order to grab the following that he does have. So I'll give him that. I guess the sad part is that people fall for it. They don't see the con in what he is doing. And it just fascinates me that's the case, because other people can see it clearly that this man is just a trickster. He's a opportunist. He's not sincere. It's all about the grift. It's all about the scam. And yet there are millions of people who don't see it that way. It's such a polarizing thing to observe. Quite fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's because those people, I think to a certain extent goes, part of it is desperation, but I also think that, these people, there's also problems. There's long standing problems with our education system, the way that we're educating people, the way that, they understand history. There's obviously, we have a lot of Americans don't understand civics. They just don't understand how our government works, right? And they don't understand the concept of democracy, of like give and take and, compromise. And the thing is too, I think our politics has been made into a sport, right? So they see it as a zero-sum kind of game where my side has to win and the other side has to lose. That's not democracy. I mean, that happens during that's the only time that really happens is during elections, right? Where you have
But during Trump's
your
run,
side loses forever.
Yeah, but during Trump's run, everybody is looking to make the other side lose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's not even. Every vote is a end of the world kind of situation. If we don't win, it's our sides, we're going to be destroyed. Right, like America is going to cease to exist. Like some of the things they were saying were just so outlandishly false. Like, come on, dude. Joe Biden is going to bring in the socialist states of America. Like, it's like, and the thing is, like, this was supposed to happen under Obama. Remember, everyone was saying this was going to happen under Obama. So it's.
Did you see the CNN? Did you see the CNN interview with a lady who is a admitted QAnon conspiracy follower, who said that she truly and honestly believed that the day Biden was elected, he was going to, put in a phone call to China and have China come over and take over the western half of the United States. And it's like,
I did not see that, but I can believe it.
Oh my God, yeah. And she said, and then when that didn't happen, she said that she believed that Trump had some sort of master plan. And as everyone is watching the inauguration on TV, all of a sudden troops were going to come down, out of the sky in parachutes and arrest Biden and Harris and everybody and make things right. And this lady is on CNN being interviewed saying that this is what she believed. And it's like, we see things online and we hear things that people believe this, that, and the other about QAnon, but to actually see someone stand straight and look in the camera and vocalize their belief in these different crazy conspiracy theories, it's fascinating and also terrifying, because there are a significant amount of Americans who believe these things.
Yeah.
And you were talking about... Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, yeah, because I think the thing is, it goes back to education. I think the thing is, like, people don't, they don't understand valid sources versus invalid sources, right? And the thing is, if I told them I had an article from the New York Times, they'd be like, oh, I don't trust it. It's corrupt, blah, blah, blah. It's the New York Times.
Fake news.
Right? But I'm like, the thing is, they forget is, obviously, the New York Times has fact checkers. They have editorial boards. They have, there's a lot more. Has the New York Times reported false stories? Yes. Does the New York side have a specific slant? Yes. But the New York Times as a organization has a lot more, should in your mind have a lot more credibility as a news source than a post on Reddit. You don't know who this guy is.
But how do we get people, what can be done to get people back away from that line of thinking? The total rejection of fact, the total rejection of reputable, you don't have to like the slant of CNN, but it just blows my mind that people can compare CNN to Fox News.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, like, they need to. I mean, they have to honestly. Well, see, the thing is, Fox News is, as a news source, they are more sophisticated and at least more truthful than Reddit or Alex Jones or some of these others.
That's true,
right? Obviously, Fox News definitely has a bias, or they report some things and not other things. But that also happens with CNN, and I would say that.
But CNN, I just have to break in here. CNN doesn't give a microphone or a platform to QAnon conspiracy theorists, but Fox News does.
Yeah.
And to me, that delegitimizes anything that Fox News can stand for. If they have the gall to give people like that a platform, I don't understand. And this has nothing to do with free speech. If those people want to say what they want to say, they can say it wherever they want to say it. I'm just saying I don't understand why Fox News would delegitimize themselves by giving those people a platform. I don't understand.
Well, I kind of understand now, because so Fox News, and especially all news channels to a certain degree, their number one thing is obviously they want to get ratings, right?
Sure,
they want to make money.
Sure.
And the more salacious stuff, unfortunately, it's more popular, right? They're going to get more views, you're going to get more listens, the crazier it is, right? That's why if you look at their talk show lineup, I mean, if you don't have somebody like Walter Cronkite there who's doing like top edge journalism, who's really diving in to try to understand an issue, right? What you have is a bunch of people who are it's pretty much talk radio, but it's obviously televised, right? And they're going to give you all kinds of crazy, and it's very outrageous, right? So they try to find, for instance, Obama didn't wear his suit jacket in the Oval Office, right? Yeah. Now, I understand, Obama probably should have wore a suit jacket in the Oval Office. That was a tradition that all presidents did, right? Does that mean that the country's going to shit and the world's falling apart and we're in American carnage? No, it's like, you need to calibrate to a certain extent. And they're going to say, well, not enough people are saying Merry Christmas anymore, whatever it is. Yeah. Like they're literally just trying to get a rise out of people. They're trying to get people upset.
Yes.
And I don't see the value in that.
No, I don't either.
Informing people about what's going on. You're like a glorified tabloid.
Well, and it always makes me laugh because when they talked about Obama not wearing a suit jacket or Obama putting his feet up on the desk in the Oval Office, they should have in the same breath mentioned that Lyndon B. Johnson was known for not even wearing pants when he was
true. Yeah.
when he was sitting behind the desk. So
that is very true.
In the tan suit thing, you go back to the 80s. Go to the 80s when Reagan was president. He very often wore a tan suit. So they try to sensationalize. They try to sensationalize this otherness about Obama, or the otherness of some of the Muslim representatives the female Muslim representatives that we have in Congress and things like that. And when they do things like that, of course CNN has a slant, but CNN is not evil. CNN is not trying to hurt people. Fox News, to me, it seems like there is an intentional evil thread in their so-called reporting.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, to be fair, I would say that CNN, I don't think CNN is intentionally trying to hurt people, but I think some of the glib ways they come off and they identify people, especially in flyover country, or they don't address their concerns, they inadvertently hurt those people sometimes, or they don't take those people's concerns as seriously as they would take other populations' concerns, right? I think that is, we can't overlook some of those blind spots on CNN, right? And that's why, the thing is, too, that people should realize you should never just get your source of news from one outlet.
Right? Amen. Say it for the people. Say it for the people in the back. That is so important.
Read a variety of papers, right? Yes. Read the New York Times, read the Wall Street Journal, the London Times, the BBC, right? There are a number of online sources for good information, right? Yeah. Watch CNN, watch MSNBC, watch Fox News, right? Be a well-rounded person. It's just like a diet, right? You wouldn't just want to eat cabbage all day, right? Yeah, cabbage is good for you, but it's not going to give you all the essential vitamins and minerals to live a healthy life. And I think the same thing is with your information, right? And judge that information in relative to the other information sources, right? If you're reading all those other papers and you're watching those news sources, and then you go to some thing on QAnon, I would believe that you're probably less, I don't have the facts around this, but I would be willing to bet you're less likely to be influenced by that type of rhetoric if you're consuming other news sources, because you're saying, well, this doesn't make sense, it doesn't add up, I understand what these other policies are, this is a lie, this didn't happen this way, right? And you're less likely to get pulled into these cons.
Well, I get the impression, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I get the impression from things I've seen and read that a lot of QAnon supporters are people who, before QAnon, these people were never interested in watching the news or reading a newspaper or checking anything online. There's just something about the sensationalism of these conspiracy theories that grabbed these people. And this is their first exposure to, and I put it in air quotes, news. This is their first exposure. Scary, frightening, very frightening.
I think a lot of these people weren't involved in politics before.
Right.
We had if you look at the 90s and even into the 2000s, even we had the war on terror right before 2008, I would say, most Americans you could really be checked out of politics and live a good life and be fine, right? And just have your little social circle of friends and go on vacation or whatever, and you'd be okay. And I think in 2008, that stopped happening. And I think, obviously, a lot of people got hurt because of that. And I think we came back out of that recession, but a lot of people got destroyed.
Yes.
Right. A lot of people ended up homeless. People on Wall Street came back. Other people came back. People in my industry, tech industry, we were doing great. Right. But a lot of the country was not doing great. And I think Trump really spoke to those people about what was going on. And the Democratic message from Hillary Clinton was like, oh, well, everything's fine. We're achieving social justice, right? Don't worry about it, white people. You got white privilege, right? And that,
horrible message.
These people who are living in the Appalachians, or these people who are living, in burnt out areas of Cleveland, they're not feeling that white privilege. They're not getting checks, right? They're like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And they are just like, okay, well, this system is not benefiting me. I'm not doing, my kids are going to be poorer than they were before. And then you have a guy who's like, hey, I'm going to bring it back to the 1970s. I'm going to hit rewind. You're going to get all these things back. This is going to be great. What do they have to, at that point, what do they have to lose by voting for this guy?
Yeah.
What do they have to lose by investing in these, in these ideas?
It's so interesting how that very idea of rolling things back to the 70s or earlier is something that can be attractive to a white person, but me as a black guy, it sends chills down my spine, because I can go back to my childhood in the 70s when I was told I wasn't welcome at the local pool.
Yeah.
We don't want you here.
Well,
you know what I mean? So there's this element of us, not necessarily us versus them, but us and them. And I'm hoping, I don't know, maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm just seeing, roses falling from the sky, but I feel like a door is open now with the Biden administration. A door is open that can lead to a better unity, a more real unity, a factual unity. Am I wrong? It's early. It's very early. It's very early. But I guess I'm combining Biden's rhetoric so far, his rhetoric, some of these executive orders that he has signed, and the weariness of America, because we're tired after these 4 years of division, these 4 years of amplifying racist elements that we've had under Trump. I think people really want to gravitate to a new unity. Am I wrong? I'm not crazy, am I? I'm not crazy for thinking that.
I see those people. Those people exist. My concern is you have those people who are kind of like in the center. Myself, you, I think, President Biden, other people who are trying. We want to like bring it back to. I guess I want to go back to 2000. I'm not even. I guess I want to go back to 2000 or 2005, right? Like,
right around there.
I'm just trying to. That's where I'm trying to get back to. But we have other elements in this country that I think, especially so now we have, like I said, we have these elements that have taken over the Republican Party, who they really want an authoritarian government, right? They want to have, President Trump for life. And, the Congress becomes a rubber stamp organization for only ceremonial purposes. And we have this kind of, the dictatorial kind of state, right? So there's those people out there who really are like, this hasn't worked. This is what we need to do. And then you have people on the left, who are like, well, we need a revolution. If the system's not working anymore, we want to, they want to get rid of the things like the filibuster and all these other things that kind of concern me, because I understand, like, so for instance, just take this filibuster real quick. I understand their concerns that they can't get they're saying, well, we can't get our agenda passed, so we need to change the rules. We need to change the structure, right? But I think what they don't remember is once you change the structure, once you change the rule, that cuts both ways.
It swings around.
Right?
Yep.
And
and what helps you today will hurt you tomorrow.
They have to remember is demographically, the Republicans have a natural built-in advantage when it comes to the Senate. right?
Yeah.
And if you decide you're going to blow up the filibuster, well, when those guys come back in, and there's a pretty good mathematical chance they're going to come back into power, they're only going to need 51 votes to change things, right?
Yeah.
Civil rights is gone. All these other things that are gone, the things you like now, child parenthood's gone, gun laws.
You said civil rights. You said civil rights would be gone. Do you think civil rights would be gone, to quote you? And if they are gone, what elements of civil rights do you think will disappear? Let's talk about racism in America today.
Yeah, we should talk about that
because it has been
why I want to talk to you about
because there has been an evolution of racism. Racism in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid is not what racism is today, or is it? Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So racism. So the thing is, I think to remember is that racism is a social construct. But as a social construct, racism is very powerful. It's very strong, right? So, because the thing is, it seems kind of hollow when you say racism doesn't. It's make believe, and it is to a certain extent. But it's like cash money, right? Yeah. That's how racism operates. Yeah, pieces of paper who have dead presidents or leaders on it or whatever else that says it's $5. Me and you only respect that it's $5 because we have agreed, and we grew up in a society that says that's $5, right? Yeah. But if our society fell apart tomorrow, that would just be a piece of paper.
Right.
But that piece of paper controls our life, right? Or on those numbers on a computer screen. It's all make-believe, right? Money just to a certain extent. It's an agreed upon value of value, right, or of exchange, and that structures your whole life. Either, if I have, a six-figure bank account, I'm living in a nice home, I'm doing good. If I don't, I'm living in a cardboard box underneath the bridge, right? And I say that because I don't want to undervalue the power of racism or this social construct, right? So I want to kind of give an analogy. So that being said, social constructs change over time. And they have changed significantly over time. Who is considered white and who is not considered white is fluctuates. And how societies have organized themselves around racist principles or things of that nature have changed, and they will change. So I think, on some level, things in the United States haven't changed, right, since the 70s and 80s. You still have those people, you still have those ideas, but on some level they have changed. So for instance, we talked earlier about obviously the Republican Party or politics in general. And I remember when I was a boy in the 80s, if somebody said you were racist, that was a really bad thing.
Yes.
Right? People were ashamed.
Yes.
Right? That was something I think I agree. To this day, if you're a racist, that should be something that you should be ashamed of.
Yeah.
But I think now racism is much more. It's vogue. It's like back with. I've heard people say racist things on the radio. I've heard people say racist things in my own life, and it's like shit, man. Like you can't say that, man. Like there used to be a time where people, even people who thought it, wouldn't say it out loud because they were afraid of the social repercussions, and they knew that. So
what made it okay to come out and be that way now?
I think Trump really made it okay because I think to a certain extent, when he came down that elevator and he said that Mexicans were drug dealers and rapists, and I suppose a few of them are good people, right? The racists were like, oh my God, like he just came out and said it. And then I think it wasn't just that incident. I think it was the follow-up interview. I remember with Anderson Cooper, right? He interviewed Trump and he was like, do you want to retract your statement? Do you want to rephrase
I remember that.
We know you're new to politics. Maybe you didn't mean it the way
he gave him every chance to back out of that.
Yeah. And so I think Trump was like, I think many other politicians, because I heard, Jeb Bush and somebody else they were running for president at the time. They were like, oh, he's done. Game over, right? He stepped in it. Because remember, Mitt Romney got in trouble only 4 years before that for saying that 47% of the population is dependent on the government.
Yeah.
And which now is so like meek and mild, like, oh my God, remember?
Yeah.
And they nailed him to the cross for this. This guy comes down the elevator and was like, yeah. But the thing is that he understood was, if you never apologize and and I understand that from sales sometimes, if you don't apologize and you just stick with it, sometimes people respect you more. And I think he just told Anderson Cooper. Anderson Cooper was in shock. And you're right.
I saw
he asked
that,
him like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
And he was just like, nope, that's what it is. And they're like, he was like, oh my God, right? And he did not let off of that message.
He made a lot of friends. He made a lot of friends that day.
Oh, yeah. And people were like, okay, because people were like, well, he's going to say how it is, right? And I think the thing is, a lot of people had felt that, right? And I think we had gone through a period. Because the other thing is, when Obama was elected, I think Obama was elected under certain circumstances. I think for one is even if you don't like him, you have to admit that he is an exceptional individual, right? He's, and I know this people are going to be like, oh, you're racist for saying this, Jeff, but I will say it. He is extremely articulate. And I'm not just saying that because he's a black person. I'm just saying across the board.
I agree.
His soaring oratory, his ability to speak to crowds, right? That made him a once in a kind of generational kind of president up there with like a JFK or somebody,
Absolutely.
Right? So there was that. We were in the middle of a recession, right? At that point, the economy was falling apart. And a lot of Americans wanted to grasp onto something, right? And I think especially a lot of white Americans saw it as an opportunity. They were like, well, we can make right. And it did sort of. There was an element of truth that they were like, we obviously had slavery, we had Jim Crow. This is an opportunity for us to kind of put some of that to bed, right? We can make the situation better. We can vote for this guy. And of course, John McCain, he had kind of lived, he was kind of past his prime as well. So under those special circumstances, Obama got elected, right? And I don't think that the whole country, that is, was ready for a black president.
No, obviously there was a segment of the United States that was flabbergasted, enraged that a black man was there. Obviously,
but I think even people.
Let's just admit that, yeah.
I think people who had voted for him, they regretted it, or they came to be more racist. Because I think there was a moment in time where because the thing is too with racism, I think racism doesn't just work on the ideological thing, right? Like, I believe I'm a racist, but racism also has a very in-group dynamic, right? If the people around you are all racist, right, it's hard for you to step out of that kind of paradigm, right? Because you're feeling pressure within the group.
Yeah, people don't want to touch. It's a hot potato. It's a very electrifying subject, and a lot of people just don't want to approach it. So they kind of just go along with the flow. Their mom and dad, they got a couple of uncles who are racist, who look longingly at the old South with slavery and whatnot, and they just kind of keep their mouths shut. But not only will they keep their mouths shut and not speak against it, but they may actually go along in certain instances, in certain circumstances, go along with it.
Yeah, because I saw it. They did a study, and this was a little while back. They did a study like 5 or 6 years ago, like online dating. And they had these young people, and it was in Britain. And they had this one British guy, who's a white guy, of course, and he was very like, no, I will not date other races. I won't do whatever. And I wouldn't say he was overtly racist, but he did say these views, which everyone was kind of like, oh, wow, whatever, right? Yeah. And then when they did the blind study, the interesting thing is they like hooked up these devices and everything. They saw how they looked or how they reacted when they had conversations with everybody, the different races and everything. There were only 2 people that the study said weren't racist.
Oh, wow.
Him and this other black guy, right? Everybody else showed a degree of racism, but this guy didn't, right? But he, for some reason, felt compelled to say this, right? So and now granted, I'm making a guess, but my guess is, this is all subjective, but my guess is that he must have grown up in a family where they were like, okay, this you can't do, or you can't show these kinds of ideas. You can't show these, because people are, to a certain extent as well, like taught racism.
Sure.
Right. And even if they believe, because especially when we talk about, Jim Crow, right? There were people in the South, there were white people in the South that didn't like Jim Crow, right? That didn't want to treat black people that way. But if they didn't, they themselves could very quickly get in trouble. And even they could end up on the wrong end of a rope, right? So they had to be very mindful of what they said or what they did. Like, so for instance, and that's why the thing is, many people think about Americans, they're like, oh, Jim Crow was just like, I think sometimes in history class, they're like, well, this is a bad thing that happened to just black people, right? But it was not just a bad thing that happened to black people. It also was a bad thing for white people, because white people got hurt by the system as well. It was worse, obviously, in magnitude for black people, but there was an element that was not. So, for instance, if a white person went and ate with black people, you were going to get in trouble, right? You couldn't sit down and have a meal with black people, right? That was verboten, right? So there was all these rules, that you had to abide by, right? If you were a white person and a black person called you by your first name, right, that was a sign of deep disrespect, and that you had to become viscerally violent, because you had to become viscerally violent in a moment to maintain that social order. Because if you didn't, and they found out, they're like, well, John just called you by your first name. Did you just let that happen? Right?
Right.
You were going to be in trouble. So I think there is an element of this, the social system. These people kind of, hold it together. They kind of hold that system together. And
well, it's comfortable. It's comfortable for them. Isn't that a sign? Isn't that a sign that white privilege is real? That one could be one who actually is not racist, but they actively participate in holding up the racist system for their own comfort.
Well,
I got to put on some socks while you answer here.
Yeah, sometimes it is comfort, but other times I think it's also fear, right? Because it's a fear of repercussions. And I could tell you of one instance in my life that I'm not very proud about. I knew this girl, right? So she was a black girl, and she was in my college, and she was a pretty girl, and I knew that she semi-liked me, and I thought about dating her. And the reason I did not date her was because I was afraid of what some of my frat brothers would say, especially one specific frat brother, right? And I was like, dude, if I date her, he is going to give me all kinds of shit. So I very cowardly were like, I'm not going to ask her out, right? Yeah. And that was the wrong decision and I was young at the time. I was, 19, 20 years old, but it's not an excuse necessarily. I didn't harm her, of course, but that was a decision that I made based on somebody else's racist beliefs that was in the group, right?
Right. And I think that happens a lot.
Yeah.
I think that happens a lot.
Yeah, that does. I think that does happen a lot amongst white people, because you have people who, and that's the thing is too, I think, with white people, when I am with other white people and they do kind of express racist views, I just I just take it as like, I don't try to do because that's not who I am. I don't try to do the social justice warrior thing. You should be ashamed of yourself. I just look at them and I'm just saying, I just say you're being ridiculous. Like, you're like that's like when somebody starts telling me about Santa Claus, like, you really believe that, bro? Right. Like, are you really gonna hold that flag up right now? Right? Are you really gonna tell me that? And just, and I just embarrass them a little bit by saying, like, that's not realistic. Yeah. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not how that happened.
But see, that's what we need. I think that alone, if a larger percentage of the white population in America would do just that, I think it would go a long way towards changing the social structure in America, and it would go a long way towards erasing racism in America.
Well, yeah, I think
believe that.
Like one of the ones is like, well, slavery wasn't that bad. It's like, come on, bro, you really think so? Do you hear
people say that?
Yeah. I've heard people. I've read people say that. I've seen people say that, and it's just like, well, because they're like, well, because they had a house and they were given food and blah blah blah, and they had guaranteed work. I'm like, dude, if I had you out there and I was working you 18-hour days and I was whipping your back and you were picking cotton, and I don't, that's literally back-breaking work.
See, and it's really frightening. It's really frightening because I do believe there's a significant amount of people in America who believe that racism wasn't that bad. I mean, you hear it, you see it daily on social media. People are, get over it. Why are you bringing this up? Why are you bringing this up? Well, this isn't an issue. And I think you can also look at the efforts of the Trump administration. His 1776 project was going to, it was set up in part to erase some historical facts about what race or what slavery was all about and how it affected black people and how it affected the American society then and now. And that is a frightening thing to think that program got a stamp of approval from the Trump administration. And thank God we have Joe Biden and his administration who has taken that away now.
Yeah. Well, I think the things with history is that you should have professional historians, people who are trained, deal with this. And because the thing is, I think that was really made in response to the 1619 project. And I think there was a lot of legitimate pushback against the 1619 project.
Tell me how that pushback is legitimate.
So the thing is with the 16, and not all of the 16, because the 1619 project, which I actually have not read all of it. I will say that from the top, and that's because it's behind a paywall, and I didn't feel like paying to get it. I should, but I haven't had the need to. But I understand the main argument was, that something to the effect of the United States didn't start in 1776. The United States started in 1619 with the introduction of slaves to the United States. I don't need to know much more. I mean, I've heard other arguments and debates around it, but the thing is, my pushback or other historians' pushbacks on that has been, there was a lot of things happening in America, right? Well, first of all, the difference between 1776 and 1619, right? So yes, slaves did arrive in North America in 1619, but at that point, if I remember correctly, New York was a Dutch colony at that point, right? So it wasn't even British yet. So there was no United States yet. There was, so you can't really, you could hold it on the Europeans, right? But there was no United States yet. So you can't say that is necessarily an American sin. Right, so slavery pre-existed the United States a long time, right? So you can't. Now the fact that U.S. continued slavery, you could say
there you
was
go,
a problem,
exactly,
right? From what they said, but you can't say that. And then the other thing is there were obviously, yes, black people and slavery was an important element in American history that has been neglected and hasn't been fully elaborated. But at the same time, it's not the only subject. That's the only aspect of American history, right? You have to.
But that's not what the 1619 project is pushing. It can be debated, of course, whether America, technically or symbolically existed in 1619. I get it. That can, and maybe that's a mistake that the 1619 project made. Maybe they should have called it the 1776 project. But
that would have been more accurate, right?
But the fact that they're trying to have this awakening and this recognition of what slavery meant to the United States and what black people have contributed to the United States. Mm-hmm. Isn't that a noble cause? Isn't that?
Yeah, and it's fine. I think that's. I think them writing that document or those papers, that is absolutely fine. That's what should happen, right? That's what history is about, right? History is about arguing over these themes, arguing. I guess when I say pushback, I'm not saying rejection. I'm just saying that. That's dialogue, right? That's what happens in history all the time.
Sure.
Whatever historical subject it is, right? Yeah. There's people reinterpret the facts, or they give you their narrative around, because a lot of history is building narrative, and because there's obviously a lot of different facts, right? And she put forward a narrative. Obviously, that's the job. Other historians should come forward, and that was, I guess, one of the other elements I didn't like about 1619, and other historians came and they said things about her paper, and then they were accused of being racist, right? Because they're saying, well, you can't criticize it, which I think is a mistake, right? You should be, if someone if someone makes a historical argument, you should be able to criticize it one way or the other, right?
I will say this from what I have read, and like you, I have been reluctant to pay to read this document in its entirety. But from what I have read of the 1619 Project, there does seem to be a little bit of course, it's historically correct, but there also seems to be an emotional element to it. For example, as you say, when anyone questions anything about it, they automatically get accused. I'm seeing that left and right, especially on Twitter. Anybody who questions anything about the 1619 Project is labeled racist, and I wish they would stop doing that. I wish they would welcome the discussion, because I believe an in-depth discussion of the guts, if you will, the guts of the 1619 Project will only lead to a further legitimacy of the 1619 Project. See, and I look at the 1619 Project and Trump's 1776 program as night and day. It's like the Bible and the Necronomicon. Because so the Trump's 1776 thing is basically lies. They want to twist history. They want to rewrite history, whereas my experience of the 1619 Project is an enlightenment of elements of history that have been neglected up through the years.
Because his is like, and I read passages of his. I didn't take the time to read through all of his after the first few passages I read, because I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. But slavery, slavery wasn't that bad. The Civil War really wasn't fought over slavery. I think if I remember correctly, that was one of the things which I cannot stand.
Yes.
Right. So it's kind of those old-fashioned kind of tropes, and it glosses over, the true horror that was, slavery and Jim Crow. Because that's the other thing is, like, I think you can look back at American history and history in general. There's a lot of bad things that happened, right? History is not like, like the one saying says, history is violence, right? Like, there were a lot of bad things. A lot of people did a lot of bad things. There were good people who tried to do good things as well, right? But America, obviously, as a 200-something-year-old country, is a complex place that had a complex beginning, and that you have to look at America as from a nuanced position, right? If you bring up what happened with slavery, you talk about the negative elements of American history. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're anti-American or that you think America's horrible. It's just highlighting facts of what happened, right? There were a lot of good things that happened in American history. I think those good things should be taught as well. And, our founding fathers were complex guys who had, they had things that were great about them and things that were not so great about them. They grew up in their own world in their own time, and you also have to take that into consideration. The other thing is that before people make like snap judgment decisions about these individuals from like a 21st century perspective, is that you have to always try to remain as open as you can about the facts that you're taking in, or try to understand the full story, because on the surface of it, things are sometimes a lot more complex than we would like to understand, right? I mean, George Washington, he grew up in a slave system. The slavery was, at that time in the world, there was a lot of slavery. White people, Europeans were slavery. I mean, one thing that's not talked about as much is, there was a European slave trade that existed roughly around the same time that the Triangle slave trade that existed, because you had the Barbary Coast pirates that were raiding. They were raiding as far as Iceland and Britain and southern France, the Mediterranean, and they were kidnapping white people, or Europeans, I should say, and they were bringing them back to North Africa to sell on the North African slave market. Now, granted, they did not sell as many or capture as many white people as were sold in the African triangle trade of slavery. But slavery was something that was a known business that existed for thousands of years, unfortunately, because it was before the Industrial Revolution. So it was a cheap way to get manual labor.
So what do you say then?
Yeah.
So what do you say then is the difference? There's an obvious difference when we look at how people react to that form of slavery versus American or North American slavery. Why is it different? Why do you think it's? Tell me your thoughts on that.
So the thing is with American slavery, the thing is that American slavery became racialized for a couple of different reasons, right? So racism throughout the rest of the world, leading up to that point, like let's for instance the Roman Empire. Anyone could be a citizen. Anyone could be a Roman slave. If you were a German, could be a Roman citizen and also be a slave. A Nubian could be a Roman citizen and be a slave. There was even a black Roman emperor, right? Rome did not think in those terms. Rome was either you speak Latin and you have Roman customs and you're Roman, or you don't and you're a barbarian. And they treated barbarians pretty damn bad, right? They treated their slaves pretty bad, right? Yeah. But to a certain extent, Rome was equal opportunity, right? It was, it had its own system, but it was to a certain extent equal opportunity. What happened with America and American racialized slavery was something that did not happen overnight, but it was a long-term system that took a few hundred years to develop. So slavery in the past, one second, my cat is like coughing. Sorry. I don't want to get that caught on tape. but slavery in the past in America, so Africa was a major source of slaves during that period, the 15th century, right?
Yeah.
And with Africa being the major source of slave, because there was a lot of internal slavery in Africa. Because as far as I understand the economic system at the time in Africa, and this is all up and down, so from what I understand, a little bit north of Nigeria, all the way down to present day, like Namibia, right? All the way down the coast. And it shifted from place to place, right?
Yeah.
Because it's somewhat important to understand what was happening in Africa. In Africa, from what I have read and understand, you couldn't own land. The king typically owned land, right? So to show wealth, to show power in Africa, people had slaves, right? And one of the easiest ways to get slaves was raiding, warfare with your neighboring kingdom, right? So there was a lot of individual warfare. There was a big market for slaves. So there was a lot of slaves that were available from Africa. And the thing is, I also want to point out this conception. We have the conception of, or a lot of people ask the question of, well, why would they sell other black people? It's very, very important to understand that they did not think that way, right? Neither did the whites at that point. They thought these other people are my enemy. Just like we talk about the French and Germans killing each other, we don't say, why would these white people kill each other, right?
Exactly.
It's automatically assumed they're French and German. There's a difference to them. So Congolese and other people, they understand the difference between the tribes. Like even today, Hutus and Tutsis, they understand that we don't.
Perfect example.
Right?
Yeah.
So obviously in Africa, you had these various kingdoms. That was big business. Slavery was big business. And in Europe, you had feudalism, right? So there wasn't many white European slaves that were left, right? And Europe, starting in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople, because you've heard the word like Slavs, right, for the Slavic races, right? That actually comes from the root word of slave, right? Because there used to be a lot of trading markets that would bring in people from Eastern Europe, the Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire would sell slaves in Spain and Italy and these other places, right?
Yeah.
But after the fall of Constantinople, those slaves started to go to the Ottoman Empire, right? So at that point in time, starting in the 1500s, when the Portuguese and the Spanish started to go out, and later the English, French, and Dutch, the only real source of a lot of slaves in the world was Africa. Right. Africa was where you wanted to go. And the Africans wanted to sell these slaves to them, right? Because they wanted to get rich. So, right, the Portuguese and especially the Spanish and later the Dutch, the French, and the British, they didn't come in, like one of the misconceptions that you'll see sometimes, and especially some of the older movies like Roots, they'll show like raiding parties going in to like capture black people. That did happen, but it was extremely rare. And one of the reasons why that didn't happen was because, for one, the Europeans didn't know the land, right?
Exactly.
So for them to land their boats and to go in, that was dangerous for them, right?
Sure.
They wanted to stay on their ships,
Sure.
right? And two, it would mess up their business operations, right? Because they had traders, they had people they dealt with on a regular regular basis to do business, right? So they would bring them gold, silver, iron, whatever, cloth, whatever the guns the Africans wanted, and they would get slaves traded with them. And they didn't even, and this, they obviously they weren't militarily enough as well powerful to conquer these African kingdoms or, force them to do what they wanted them to do. This was both sides wanted this. And in some extent, they even intermarried, right? You even had Portuguese and Spanish in the early part intermarrying with these African kingdoms, and you even had biracial crews. You had individuals who were both white and black, who knew both cultures, that worked and of course, these are not things that are portrayed because I think our understanding of race, and we're ourselves, that understanding is so black and white. It's hard for us to understand that there would be a biracial captain of a slave ship transporting slaves back and forth, right? But these guys, hey man, this was business. I'm going to put these people into this hold of the ship, and we're going to overfill it.
Yep.
And somebody are going to die along the way, but that's what we're going to do. So unfortunately, as harsh as that sounds, this was a pure business.
Yeah, they just ran the numbers and they saw the profit and profit and loss. Will the profit support so much of a loss? If the answer is yes, let's run with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's how, so in the beginning, when they were bringing the slaves over, right, it was just a business, and the white people, and because the thing is too, in America was multiracial at that point. Many people imagine the Pilgrims coming over. Well, obviously there were the Native Americans here already. The Africans started to show up shortly thereafter in 1619, right? And they started to colonize. And the thing is, unlike Europe, skin color became a quick marker or understanding what culture where these people are coming from, right? Obviously, he's black, he must be coming from Africa. Well, he's white, or he looks white, he must be from Europe. Yeah. Oh, he's kind of a tannish, reddish, he's Native American, right? So that became a quick identity marker that people, but over time, this, because they weren't bringing in white slaves, right? They were bringing in white indentured servants who had to serve 10-year contracts or whatever it was. And then get their freedom. But everyone in the beginning as well, in many of the colonies, blacks would not be held for their entire lives as well.
That's true. That is a little known fact. Some of them were able to work for their freedom. Yeah.
Yeah, and especially in New York, which is funny because that's what the one they outlined in 1619. If they could prove that they had turned to Protestant, they had become Christian, they were given their freedom, because of course the Dutch were Protestants, and they, with the Bible, they weren't really sure if this was legitimate to keep these people in slavery, right? And obviously had different levels of slavery.
Can you imagine if those Dutch who wondered whether slavery was right or wrong, if they would have spoken up a little bit louder back in the early or the middle 1600s? What a different America we would have.
Well, I think that the thing is, America could have, many points in America's path, it could have taken a different direction than what it decided to take. Yeah. And America could look a lot differently complexion-wise. Because the other thing is that in the beginning, indentured servants and black slaves, especially in the North, right? Because we always think of slavery, we think of the Southern context. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, in the North, it was a lot more industrialized context, right, where slaves were working in small workshops. There were people were owning like maybe 1 or 2 slaves or 4 slaves, right? Even rich people at that time in like Boston, they might have like 12 slaves on staff, right? Yeah. Not like a large plantation. It wasn't like the South.
More like house servants and working the trades. A blacksmith, a seamstress, things like that.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, poor whites and indentured servants and black slaves, everyone was hanging out. People people ate together. They were having children together. One of the things that happened in the North, which the South could not understand, was that white Northern owners, slave owners, I'm not trying to make it better, but it was different. That's what I'm trying to say. They used to eat. They would even eat with their slaves at the same table, right? Yeah. So that was they would work with their slaves in the same workshop, right? So for Southerners who would come to visit, this is back when the North still had slavery, they're like, dude, this is, why don't you guys do it, right? So, and I think, well, Southern slavery developed differently because they needed more, and because they, like we talked about the other day, in the beginning, they used a lot of indentured servants because, of course, in Virginia, there was tobacco was the cash crop.
Yeah.
And then you had the English Civil War in the 1640s, and they were getting far less indentured servants and slaves and white people that they could pick the tobacco with, right? So they became more and more dependent on bringing in slaves from Africa to fulfill this. And then the issue was, well, we can't have these white people and these black people forming any kind of legitimacy, right? So we need to separate them, right? So we'll give them, these whites, more rights and give them more so that they will back us in maintaining the slave population, right? Because now we're starting to be outnumbered on our own plantations.
I was going to say
a big foremen and everything.
Yeah, I was going to say a big difference for the different atmosphere between northern slavery in the early days of slavery and southern slavery is an issue of numbers, because up north there is a much larger population of people in general, and they also did not need, that you, like you said, it would be a household with maybe just a couple slaves, maybe 4 or 5, to work basically in the trades and to be house servants. Whereas in the South, there's a different numerical dynamic because you have a plantation with the nuclear family, husband, wife, and maybe 2 or 3 kids. But this plantation needed, 50 to 100 hands to work it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thus, the necessity for a more controlling and brutal slave system in the South. And that's quite important.
100%.
That explains a lot for people. See, and you and I know this. You and I have read, studied this. I've actively studied these things. You and I know these things. I hope people are listening, and I hope people are taking in this information, because these things that happened so many hundreds of years ago are the reason why we have the issue with race in America today. I don't believe that the issue with race in America today, racism in America today, can be solved when we have so many people who are ignorant of the history of America and the racist element of slavery that is embedded in that history. And that is why I'm a supporter, and I get it. Like I said, I think there's a little bit of emotion that's put into the 1619 Project, which then dampens a bit of the factual history that is trying to be promoted in the 1619 Project. But I am a strong supporter of the 1619 Project because I believe that people must know the true history of America if we're going to make a better unity today.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I think that I guess it's just because I'm a historian. I do think, I understand how it's an emotional thing, but I do think you should try to get the facts as close as possible as you can always.
Totally agree.
Going to be points that are
totally agree. Absolutely. But, yeah. I wish they would, I said, I wish they would stop trying to label people racist just because they question certain parts of the 1619 Project. I wish they would stop doing that. Remove the emotion and just stick to the historical fact, because the historical fact is strong enough, powerful enough, and factual to the point where I truly believe that with more knowledge of those facts, we can change the way America works today.
Yeah, because the idea that, that's where I go to when people say things that are ridiculous, where they're like, oh, well, slavery wasn't that bad. I'm like, you're either being stupid right now or you're ignorant to what happened. It's either one of the two. But even if you take the 10 minutes to think about it, slavery in any of its contexts throughout history was never good, right? Like there was never like, oh yeah, this is an optimal slave position I want to be in, right? Like like at any point in history and no one would ever be like, yeah, I want to fly back in a time machine and be a slave of anybody, right? Like you didn't want to be in that position.
There's no such thing as a slave who is better off. If you're a slave, that is the end all be all. You are a slave, and you have Norm Macdonald is one of my favorite comedians, and he had a joke. It's not even really a joke; it's just a statement. He says, how did he say this? Let me get this right. A really big set of gold change would be a great gift for a really good slave.
Yeah,
he said that, and it's like, and it's funny. It makes you giggle, partially because it's funny, but also partly because it's just so,
it's true.
Who wants to joke about that? But to be able to pull off a joke like that, you have to be aware of the facts, the historical facts of slavery. In other words, that there was nothing good about being a slave, and it's mind-boggling that we have people in our educational system. I don't remember where I found this online, but I was looking at examples of textbooks, new textbooks that they either are distributing in Texas or they want to distribute in Texas, and how they were formulating all things that had to do with slavery. And it's just, you see the slave smiling, well-dressed, healthy.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that movie, The Patriot, with Bruce. With Mel Gibson. I was like, dude, come on, man.
It's a great movie. It's a great movie.
And they're all like happy to see Massa come back. I'm like, come on.
I like that movie. It's a great movie. I like the action in it, but I'm torn because I get
just a movie. That is not.
I get furious about the historical, and I watched that movie with our kids. Let's see, they're 15 and 13 now. This was maybe 5 years ago. I watched that movie with our kids, and I think I wore out the pause button on the remote control because I'm like, okay, this is what they showed now in the movie, but here's how it really, and they got a history lesson through that movie. I think it took us a couple of days to watch it.
I think the best one, or one of the best interpretations I saw of slavery, although not perfect, was like 12 Years a Slave.
Yes.
I thought that was a really good interpretation, especially because they show a couple elements in there that aren't normally told about the slave story.
What is it that stands out for you? That was
one is that he's kidnapped, right? So a lot of times I think there's a misconception that every black person in America was a slave.
Right.
Or they were growing up in bondage in the South, right? And that actually wasn't true. It was a smaller community. There were far less, but they did exist in the North. And you had educated black, and you had, what they called free Negroes at the time. And people respected them. They were just like, that's Bob that lives down the street, right? Yeah. And there wasn't kind of that like the South. So there was very different, right? And then obviously this guy got tricked, because it's based on a true story.
Yes.
He got tricked by this dick of a friend who wanted to sell him into slavery, right? Yep. And then I think the other important element that they show in there, I think if I remember correctly, it is 12 Years a Slave. And then because I will say it's never good to be a slave, because there is obviously a ceiling, right? You also have to understand that the system was complex. There were black people who were enslaved, in slavery, that supported slavery. You had what they called the Uncle Toms, and you had people who, because they personally benefited from this position, right?
Yeah.
And in the movie, they show a part where he goes to talk to the one other slave master. He gets a letter to go over to the other's plantation, and that plantation, the slave master's wife had passed away, and he's sleeping with one of the slaves, and now she is ruling over the plantation, and that is things that happen. So it was a very complex, and one of the other things, I think this goes to my other thing, is that in America we imagine the two groups, black and white, as very separate. They're separate populations, or at least you see people who are like, oh, we want to set up a white ethno state in the middle somewhere. You have people, African Americans like Farrakhan and stuff, I want to set up a black state over here in Idaho or wherever it is. And it's like, we are beyond that. We have intermixed so much, and we have been with each other for so long that we are the same population.
Well,
the thing is,
well. Having said that, I don't know how many brothers there are up in Idaho.
Well, that is true. In Idaho, maybe, but I will say that
did Farrakhan really want to move? I know he wanted an autonomous black nation within America, but where did he want it to be? Did he really say Idaho?
Honestly, I forget. I forget where he wanted it to be. Maybe, I just picked Idaho as a random state. But I do know it was further out west, or he wanted to set something up.
It wasn't like Detroit or
no, yeah, because I know he did want them to be farmers. He wanted them to be farmers and own farms.
Yeah.
But what I was saying is that demographically they say that most white Americans, they believe, have at least 1% black in them, which would mean that they're like, because if you go by the original one drop rule, which I'll talk about in a second because people should know what that is. That means most Americans, by their standards today, are black.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you have any black lineage in you, according to the system, then you're black. Right.
One drop. Yeah.
So I think even that, if most Americans realize that we're probably a majority, by the old definition, a majority black country, that's something to wrap your mind around, that we're technically speaking, you could argue a majority black country.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not like that because of the way that we perceive things, right? Because obviously today, I walk into a bank, they're like, oh, he's just a white guy. They don't know anything. Yeah. They don't do your genetic code.
But if they did,
the other thing, I would be in trouble. And the other thing that I would say is, and then for black people, most black people in America have between 24 or more percent European in them.
Yes.
Right. So we are definitely intermixed.
Yes.
Right. And we are probably, so we're basically, we have this perpetuating thing that we're I feel like a lot of times we have this perpetuating thing that we're these two separate people that we're just happen to be here together in America. I think there would, obviously because of laws and the customs that we had, the racial mixing is far less than a place like Brazil. I think if we'd gone in a different direction, like Brazil. So in Brazil, for instance, they decided that they wanted to have, because in the 1880s, 1890s, if I remember, the 1880s, 1890s, they decided that they wanted to have a more white society, because racism was all the vogue back then.
Yes.
Obviously that it was scientific back then. How can we make the society more white? Well, we'll just have all the white guys have kids with all the black women, and we'll just generally whiten ourselves up. That was their solution, right? Which is interesting. Which is it's crazy. It's silly. But in some sense, it makes a little bit more sense for what they were trying to do. It does have its own certain logic to it, but it is like, okay, whereas obviously in the United States, there were strict prohibit, on most states, it was against the law. Even in Pennsylvania, for instance, the miscegenation laws, you could not, as a white person, you could not mix.
I think there were still some laws on the books in the 70s, up until the middle 70s in some states.
Yeah. So, it wasn't until the Loving case, I think it was in the 50s, that the Supreme Court was finally like, no, we can't do this anymore. Yeah. So that was a real thing. And, even during, and it was another interesting thing, is during Reconstruction, the misogyny laws are some of the first laws that they actually got rid of. And, one of the other interesting stories that we don't really talk about from Reconstruction, because I think, because people, again, imagine Sally Hemings as being black, right? Or they inherit their mind, even in Hollywood, imagine her as being black, right? Or at least half black. But Sally Hemings was probably maybe a quarter black, because from what I understand about Sally Hemings was Jefferson had married Sally Hemings' sister. And Sally Hemings was the daughter. Her father was actually her sister's white father who owned the plantation, right? So Sally Hemings, to you or me today, would probably just appear to be a white person. Yeah. And there were many of these white people, or who to us visually would appear to be white people, who were the house slaves, right? Who were on the plantation, right? Because this is, of course, when you have the dichotomy of the field slaves and the house slaves, and obviously there was real tensions between them.
Sure.
And the house slaves they felt the need to side with
Sure.
the white owners, because if there was a rebellion like Nat Turner rebellion, all the house slaves got killed, right? It was lights out for them.
And those are the beginnings of what we call colorism within the within the black community today. The roots of that go back to the slave days and the difference in privilege between the house slaves and the field slaves.
Yeah. And when when slavery ended and Reconstruction began, you had a large portion of these people who were like, I'm passing, I'm getting out of here. Yeah. And they packed their bags and moved north, or they moved wherever they had to move. No, it wasn't easy to do that, because you had to totally, you had to leave all your family and everything else behind.
But people did it.
But it wasn't option.
There were some people who did it.
A lot of people did it. Yeah. And that's why I always find it funny when I see these Southern guys or these people in general, they're like, well, this is Confederacy is my heritage, and, so-and-so. I'm like, do you really know, man? Do you really know? Can you really say that? Because another interesting point is, J. Edgar Hoover, right, the head of the FBI, who obviously he was extremely against black people.
Yes.
He
racist to the core.
Yeah, black people should stay in their lanes.
Yep.
We know, so we think, I haven't heard enough evidence to really come out and say 100% for sure. We'd have to get DNA tests, but I know there's a lady who did her genealogy. She was doing her genealogy, and she found out, she argues, and I don't think she's trying to be malicious. I think that it could be true. She argued that she's related to J. Edgar Hoover. Now, obviously, she's a black lady, right? Yeah. And by doing her genealogy, she found out, she's like, oh, it looks like there's a clear connection, because J. Edgar Hoover's father kind of his family materialized out of nowhere in Washington, D.C., right? And it wasn't real clear whether genealogy linked back to, and it was a rumor then and throughout his life that he had black blood, and he was really aware of this, and he was really concerned about this. And so
I have read that. I have read that as well, and I think it would explain a lot of his. I mean, it was so obvious he was a racist. It was not. You don't have to think twice about it. And I wonder if it was him resenting something that he knew about his own lineage.
Yeah. I mean, it might have been. And I think the thing is, he, especially, and now granted, this might just be, I'm seeing things into it because I know this information.
Yeah.
But even if you look at pictures of him, you can see it a little bit.
Right?
he And that's the funny thing. You could see it a little bit. Now that you pointed out, I'm like, now that
I would have loved to have been around and invite old J. Edgar Hoover to the barbecue and put him in charge of the potato salad or something and see what he comes up with. I think that might have explained. I think we could have found out. Just invite him to the barbecue and put him in charge of the potato salad or something.
I mean,
how does he make it? There's a joke in there.
Yeah, there's definitely a joke in there. I mean, so the thing is, like, and the thing is too, there were a lot of, there was a lot of close relations between, even in the South during Jim Crow. I mean, Strom Thurmond had, which, didn't come out until the day after he died, right? He had a half black daughter that he sent through college.
Yeah.
And he met her in secret, had a whole secret family. Yeah. From what I understand, he really loved her, but he was like, well, my day job is being uber racist at the U.S. Senate.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing how he and he's not the only one that does that. There's something, there's a lot of historical context here where white men especially would have this thing for black women on the side in the shadows, and yet they couldn't. Yeah, I don't know. I guess this is our animalistic side where they get their sexual gratification, but it does nothing as far as their view of that woman's humanity. They can continue to be racist even though they have this relationship. But with him, it was a little different because he wasn't just having sex with a black woman. He had a whole family. I mean, he had another family across on the other side of the tracks.
And then
he took care of them. He took care of them.
Yeah. He could have just been like, I'm never going to see you again.
And it just blows my mind that he could still be outwardly racist while he has this other thing going on with not just a black woman that he's having sex with, but a black family that he is caring for. Amazing.
Yeah.
How do you do that? The mental gymnastics there, man, is it's impressive.
Well, I mean, again, I think because I think that goes to the whole. I mean, first of all, it's like a forbidden love, right? I think a lot of it is, you're right. It starts off as it's a rape rather, and you can do what you want, right? Because you have this outlet as a white man in the South at this time. But then I think most people who, if they have any feelings or if they're normal, right, they're going to grow attached to these people. Now they have a relationship. But again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, you have the social context of racism, right? You can't just, and some people, I mean, this was very rare, but it did happen. You had some guys who would just run away with them to someplace. They would go to Europe or something like that. But most would just be like, well, we're just going to have a secret family because I can't, I can't in public acknowledge you as my wife because, and you would have these women who they'd work in their home as their servants, right? But in actuality, they were their wives, but they would just never come out and say, yeah, this is my wife, right? Yeah. They would just continue to do this. And that was part of, and I will say, I wanted to just briefly touch on the one drop rule because I think maybe a lot of people might not know what that is.
Explain this from. Because, I'm sitting over here in Norway and I don't think a lot of Norwegians understand or they've probably never even heard anything about it. Yeah, talk about that for a minute.
So obviously in early America, you started having I'll say issue, but this was the issue of people that were being born that were of mixed race, right? And in Spain, obviously, the Spanish would call them mulattoes, right? And they weren't really sure like what these people's rights and privileges would be. But as we talked about before, with the decline in the population of especially coming over from England, of workers on 10-year contracts, indentured servants, they didn't want their slaves to eventually become free. And like I said, a lot of the indentured servants and the poor white frees and the blacks were freely mixing amongst each other. There wasn't sort of this idea yet, or this hard boundary between white and black. So what they decided to do was, at first it was incremental. At first they were like, well, if you're majority white, you're still white. If you got some black, you're some whatever. But eventually, as time went on, they decided to just make it one drop rule, because they said, as long as you have one drop of black blood in you, then you are a slave. Because the other issue that they had was they were obviously raping their slave women. They were having children with them, right? Or they had, not all cases, some cases it was a legitimate relationship, but in most cases, we don't have the evidence to prove, but I'm assuming these women didn't really have any kind of rights. I'm sure they didn't want to have these relationships. Or even if they did, it was in the context that they were going to be treated better than other slaves, so that's why they took these relationships.
That's still rape,
It's still rape, you're right, but it's a...
I understand, I understand.
Yeah. So... there was a context to it. It was obviously they were not meeting as two equals.
Right.
But I'm sure some slave women welcomed these relationships because it improved their lives materially speaking, right?
Yes.
But it is still a form of rape, but you're kind of in a weird kind of gray zone, right?
Yeah, they're getting some benefit in that they could maybe be moved from the slave quarters to the big house.
Yeah. Exactly.
Still a slave, though.
Yeah, you're still a slave, but, versus those other guys out there freezing in the shacks, to step up, right? Yeah. So what I was saying is that because another thing is they did not want, because the thing is they, at one point, I think it was 18, I might be forgetting the exact year, but I believe it was 1840 or so, I might be off. They stopped the import of slaves from Africa as well, right? So buying slaves became much more difficult. So an easy way for them to have more slaves is they would just be like, you'd either have your slaves reproduce, or you yourself would be the bull, so to speak, right? Yeah. And you would just reproduce with all your slave women, right? To just up your numbers, right? Yeah. And you would have your legitimate white sons join in this process, because you'd want to produce as many slaves as you can, because it's straight revenue, right? Yes. So if you had a law that was saying like, oh, well, if it's 50%, that person's free, well, then that's one less slave. It's
defeating the economic ends that they're trying to meet. Yeah.
So there's that. And the other thing is, too, there is a security element to it, because, as we said, the house slaves are always going to be more loyal than the field slaves, right? Yeah. So you were going to want to surround yourself with your relatives in the immediate household, right? Yeah. Because there's this whole element of control that goes into it. Again, which I think is kind of goes back to the madness of, when you see 12 Years a Slave, right, where they talk about, like, the first slave master, he's still a slave master. He wasn't the best guy, right? But I think it's Benedict Cumberbatch, right? But he was, as a slave master goes, he was okay. He was fair to a certain extent. He even helped save his life, right, at one point, because they got into that fight about that other crazy dude tried to kill him, right?
That's right.
And he had to defend himself. But the next guy after that was completely batshit crazy, and he was doing all kinds of crazy stuff, right? So those are kind of the situation, unfortunately, if you were a slave, that you could find yourself in, right? So that's kind of the idea, even though I got off on a tangent there, that's the idea of the one drop rule, is it had these economic and security kind of ideas to it, and this remained on the books right up through Jim Crow, right? And how people were classified, and they even had people at the hospital when you were born in the hospital in the South who would they try to verify this, because it was very important, because documents that even came to you. So let's say, for instance, if you were a black person and you had paid this, I did not know, and I found out recently from my podcast, from a show, when I was doing this research. For anybody who's interested, it's a History of the Cold War podcast.
Yeah, plug it.
So you can learn a lot more about
this. It's a great podcast, everybody. The History of the Cold War podcast.
Yeah, because we cover a lot of these subjects with Jim Crow, because I'm going through a series of episodes right now about the early civil rights movement. But to get back to what I was saying, so the utility company, they would not say, and I apologize, John, I cannot remember your last name. What's your last name?
Reese.
So they wouldn't say Mr. Reese on your bill. They would not say that, right? Or if I was black, they wouldn't say Mr. Hogue on my bill, right? Yeah. They would say Jeff, right? And as a matter of fact, as a white person that addressed a black person by their first name was actually, at that time, believe it or not, was considered a courtesy. That white person was considered to be a polite white person if they said the person's first name.
Yeah.
Most white people would refer to black people by, unfortunately, using the N-word. They would literally just be like, come over here.
Yeah.
Or they would use the boy.
Or girl.
Or an older black person would be called uncle.
Yep.
Right? A girl would just be called, I forget the term they had a specific term for a young girl. I think it would just be like girl or something like that. An older woman would be called auntie. Yep. And those were the terms that they would use, for in terms of salutation. But even on your bills, your utility statements, you could not, they would not list your last name, even in newspapers for famous African Americans like Louis Armstrong, right? Yeah. They would not list their last name because the newspaper editors were afraid that they would be showing too much respect to black people.
Isn't that something?
And that would get their paper in trouble. Right.
See, and it's those little things. It's those little things that a lot of people today walking around in America, they don't know about those kind of things. But to me, a little tidbit like that speaks volumes. It speaks volumes when it comes to to how society has been impregnated with this. It's not just a thread of racism. It's a flowing river. It's a torrential river. It's in our blood and guts in America, and it truly affects the way things are today. Now, a lot of people will hear me say that and say, "Oh my God, John, get over it. Stop pulling the race card." I hate that. Pulling the race card, but and that's not what I'm doing, and I don't want any pity. I don't want any type of privilege or sympathy. I just want justice, and I want people to be aware of the history of it, because that awareness will eventually bring justice and equality and unity. I truly believe that. You've got to know the history of our today. You have to know what brought us here.
You have to understand the context, so that when people are. Yeah, so I think a lot of white people say like, oh man, he's playing the black card again. He's just they see it as like an excuse, and they're like, well, bro, you weren't a slave. And although that is true, there's a context. Like obviously, I'm not black, but as a black person, obviously you come into a room, people see you as black. That carries all kinds of, right, especially for the other people who are viewing you, that brings, you don't know what they're going to think. You don't understand the context within their mind. And unfortunately in this country, because of our history, there's a whole context to that, right? There's a whole context of black people getting employment. There's a whole context of black people buying property, where they lived, redlining. There's a whole history behind that, which really, from a structural legal level, didn't end until the 1960s. And that's only like 2 generations ago. Yeah. And it took us 400 years to build a cradle to grave racial hierarchy system in the United States. So decided to kind of expect to be like, oh, well, that shit ended in the 60s and we just hit pause and it all just ended and we're all good now. It's like, it's not the case. I mean, I wish it was. It would be great if that was the case. Have we made progress? Yes. Have we done good things?
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. But there's still things there. And I can even bring it even closer to home because I'm 51 years old. So, and I alluded to this earlier, but in my childhood, I was maybe, and I said it was in the 70s, but it actually was in the 80s because I want to say I was 12, 13 years old. So this would be in 83, 84, where my brother and I were told by the owners of an outdoor pool in the next little village over that we weren't welcome there. Yeah. Specifically because we are black. They told us, we and other people don't want to see you socializing at our pool with little white girls.
Oh.
Okay, yeah, and that's in 1983, 84 in rural/suburban Ohio.
Ohio, yeah, not even like Mississippi.
So it's not exactly. So it's not an issue that we only had to deal with 400 years ago. This is an issue that give me that, okay, that I had to deal with that. And even if it stopped after that, if I was the last black man to ever experience racism,
which I doubt.
Exactly.
Let's go with it.
But if I was, it's still close enough in the historical spectrum to where it should be something that should be spoken about.
Yeah. Because it would be like, now granted, no, I guess I can't, I won't make that comparison, but I will, I was going to say, because I think the Holocaust was a lot worse than obviously than what you had experienced, but I will say it is kind of like, you can't deny people's lived experiences, right? I cannot deny what you experienced that day at the pool. And the emotions that you must have felt as a little kid to be told that, right? Because that is kind of like, that's world shattering, right? You can't just go to the pool and hang out with the other kids because you're somehow dirty or different or something, right? And I think part of that is that people have to learn to empathize, right? Like understand that. I think I would say as a white person, maybe I'm wrong, but this is just my view. I would say the one thing is, you have to learn to empathize or understand the context and that's your lived experience and that you should respect what the other person is telling you unless you have unless what you're saying sounds super far-fetched or it sounds or you have evidence that says that's not the case.
Yeah, right? But you know what? When I say something like that to a lot of people, it sounds far-fetched. I've related that experience to people and they just kind of roll their eyes and don't really have too much to say. And it's quite obvious they don't believe me.
I think maybe that's because, and I guess I can only again speak for myself, maybe that's because A, I understand the historical context. Yeah. And then B, I didn't have to deal with racism from that perspective, but I've seen it from the other perspective. I remember semi-famous story, I guess, from my life in racism. This was like in the early 2000s, and I had a job in college. I worked at a park, right, like a naval museum, and we used to take care of ships. I used to do like restoration work on these ships, and there were a couple of black guys that we worked with, and something should have tipped me off as well because one of the other black guys, his name was Jeff, right? So people at the other people in the company we worked at thought it was funny to say they called me White Jeff and they called him Black Jeff, right? And I didn't think anything of it at the time because I was like, whatever. And actually, they were okay with it. They kind of went with it too, right? so that we could kind of know who we were talking about when we said Jeff, right?
Uh-huh.
And I forget I think the other guy's name was Daniel or something, but they told me, they're like, yeah, man, this place is pretty racist. You probably, because we used to, I liked them, they liked me, we used to hang out. They're like, you probably don't want to hang out with us a lot because you're going to get in trouble, right? They're not going to like that you hang out with us.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, what? And I was like, dude, are you serious? Like, what? And again, this isn't Buffalo, mind you. So we're not like, this is not Alabama.
No.
And I was like, dude, I thought that they were exaggerating, that they were making this up, right? And I will say, obviously not all white people in Buffalo are racist. That's not what I'm trying to say.
No.
But there are obviously some people there who, unfortunately, are racist, I will say, since I grew up there, and this is what happened with me. So to continue the story, I really didn't take what they said too serious. I thought that they, kind of like yourself, I thought they were being hyperbolic.
Yeah.
Right? And as the months went on, I started to see things. But one specific event is we had a bunch of kids that came in from high school kids. The city had a program to help inner city kids get a job, right? So there were a bunch of like Hispanic and African-American kids who came to work on the ship. And they had to paint some part of the ship. I had to do something else. I was at another part of the ship. Jeff and the other gentleman were there watching them. A black Jeff, I should say, was there. And he was watching. I guess there's clarity to what I'm saying now.
Uh-huh.
And they were, I guess they were supervising, right? So obviously the main guy who ran the park was white, and his son was there as like the number two. And he was white as well. He ran it. And there were obviously, everyone who was in the administration staff was white. Again, I didn't think about this. I didn't think it was an issue. I just did it right. And even though both the black gentlemen had been there longer than them, right? Now, obviously, they had worked there for like 20-something years, right?
Uh-huh.
Whereas like the top guy had only been there for 5, right? But again, as a young man at that point, I wasn't taking those kinds of insights into the situation. I was just working there for the summer for money.
Yeah.
And at one point, I started hearing yelling. So I walk over, and there's some of the high school kids, they dropped paint all over the place. It's a mess, right? The number 2 white guy comes over and says, Jeff, what the hell is going on here? Uh-huh. And I was like, well, it looks like they dropped some paint. That's what it looks going on. He said, he said to me, and he was serious. He said, who's in charge here? And I said, Jeff,
uh-huh.
right? Because Jeff was the senior guy to me. He was like, no, Jeff is not in charge here. You're in charge here, right? And I said, well, Jeff's been here for 20 years. This is my summer job, right? He said to me, and I'm not joking, he was serious. He said to me, Jeff, you are a white man here. You are in charge.
Oh, wow.
Right? And he said, as long as you're colored people here and you're the white man here, you are in charge. Let me tell you that right now. And I was like, it was, when like something, car crashes or something in your head. Like, I was like, whoa, like, what is happening right now? Right? Like,
you're not supposed to hear things like that. How do you?
Exactly. And again, this is like 2002 or something like that. I'm like, what? And I'm not supposed to hear something. I didn't know how to react to this. I didn't know. I was just kind of like, and then he kind of he I guess he saw that I was shocked a little. Then he like started joking with me a little bit. He's like, listen, you're the white guy in here. You're in charge. He's like, you got to watch them. They don't know what they're doing, blah, blah, blah. Like, and he went off on this whole, and I didn't argue back because I was kind of still in like a little bit of shock about what was happening. This was actually happening. This is my life right now. And this guy is standing here telling me this. And, and I was like, okay, and I was like, all right. And it was a weird, I remember like the bike ride home, I'm like, I just got in trouble because I wasn't racist enough. Like, what just happened, right?
I wonder.
So I guess, when you tell me kind of experiences like that, that's why I kind of like, okay, I can believe that maybe more than other white people. Because I don't know if other white people have been put in that position.
Because think about this. Think about how many lives that guy affected negatively. Yeah. Because that is the way he thinks. Him saying this to you is not the only time that came up in this guy's life.
Oh, yeah.
Think about how many people he deals with. Think about how many people he has power over, and think about what his attitude, that racist attitude, can do and how it can affect people's lives. And that is institutional racism, people. That is why institutional racism is a thing, because people in positions of power like that guy, or, well, people in much higher positions of power than that guy, have a way of thinking like that, and they control people's lives.
Yeah, and I saw on another occasion, there was like a girl that used to come and she'd take the tickets, a ticket girl. She was like a young Hispanic girl who used to come, and then there was this other guy who I just couldn't stand. He was as a white guy who was like lazy. He's like the laziest people I ever know. He was in our crew. He never wanted to work. He never wanted to do what he wanted to do. But and I was friends with his sister, and he himself was a racist as well. And he went to him, this number 2 guy, the same guy that told me that day, and he's like, hey, I don't want to do this job anymore, but I want a new job. Right? Talk about white privilege. And we and the other guys in the crew, the other white guys, are like, dude, this guy should be fired. He's lazy. He doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't want to work. Right? We all didn't like him, and because his name was Adam. And he was like, so the Hispanic girl, she decided, now she did make a mistake. She should not have done this. She decided to leave 20 minutes early, and she forged the logbook and said that she had left 20 minutes early. Okay, right? Yeah. And he went in and he found this mistake. He found the thing. He fired her on the spot and put this guy in. This Adam guy, and gave him her job, right? Okay, yeah. And he ended up working her job the rest of that summer. And I was like, dude, like, and it was because Adam had made more egregious offenses than her on multiple occasions. He would give us a job to do. Adam would just literally just sit in the workplace and just eat and like listen to music, and wouldn't go, and it would just be us four that would do the job, right? So he would just clear dereliction of duty, right? Yeah. And and this is how they operated there. And I was like, and I kind of opened my eyes. I was like, okay, what Jeff and the other guy had told me, that was the truth. This is how this place operates, and this is jacked up. And so I guess coming from that experience, that is why I think I'm more likely to believe this. But also going to your point, what you said about, he's affecting others. I was a young man. I mean, I wasn't super young, but I was still relatively young, right? Yeah. And this guy is telling me this at this point in my life. Yeah. Who knows what he's telling his kids? Exactly. What he's telling other kids. Exactly. Right. And the thing is, those kinds of ideas get into people's heads, and then it's hard to deconstruct that. Sure, right? It is. Because if that's what you're brought up on, that's your truth.
Think about how the effect would be if that guy was in a supervisory position at a police department, or the head of a police department, or a local politician, or a state politician, or in the White House. Yeah. What if? And because we know, you just have to admit, it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, it doesn't matter who you are, you've got to admit that guy is not the only guy in America who thinks like that. So then we can safely assume that people like him are in significant positions of power, and therein lie the roots of institutional racism. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It's man, I could talk about this stuff forever, but we do have to wind this up. My lovely family has peeked their heads in the door several times. Dinner is waiting. It's tacos. It's Taco Saturday here in the household.
Taco Saturdays in Norway.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's usually Taco Friday, but I resist. I resist total integration into Norwegian society. So here it's tacos on Saturday.
Yeah.
What? Tell people again the name of your podcast and where they can find you.
Sure. So you can actually just look us up online if you want to. We have a website called the History of the Cold War Podcast. So if you Google History of the Cold War Podcast, we should come up. Or you can find us on iTunes or other platforms at just the History of the Cold War Podcast. And we, like I said, I explore a lot of different issues in regards to history on that podcast. Obviously, most of it's based around the Cold War. But I am currently doing a series of episodes on looking at the early civil rights movement. But beyond that, I take a step back to look at how racism developed in the West, or what Western racism looks like. Obviously, racism looks like different ways in different parts of the world at different times. But I go into great detail explaining Jim Crow, and also, obviously, and at this point, I'm starting to look at the early civil rights movement and what that looked like and how that developed, and what are the connections there between the Cold War and civil rights, because there might not seem to be a connection between those two subjects, because they're often taught as two separate subjects, but they're actually very intertwined.
Yes.
And events that were happening in the outside world affected what was happening domestically in the United States, and domestic events in the United States were having an impact on U.S. foreign policy. So I go into explaining that and how those events really brought about the end of legal structural racism. There's obviously still elements of racism in American society, but the legal aspects of racism, and then the scientific aspect of racism, which I wish we would have had enough time to talk about, but maybe that's another conversation for another day.
Oh, I'm going to have you back on for sure. I like this stuff, man. I like this stuff with you. So
yeah, definitely.
It's very enlightening. I think it can be enlightening for people who have sat over the last couple hours and followed this conversation, because it's a sad fact that not everybody is aware of American history. It's a sad fact that people may have a certain amount of awareness of American history, but they willfully brush away that thread of American history that is slavery, that is racism, that is contributions of Black Americans to America. I hope this conversation has opened some eyes.
And I think what I really want to say to those types of people, because I do meet those people, because they're of the opinion of
they're out there,
sort of like, well, there's a bad story in there, then America must be bad.
Yeah,
right.
You know?
And I don't necessarily believe. I think those people, you have to understand that American history, the world in general, is a complex place.
It is. It is.
And just because some bad things happen doesn't mean that America is a horrible place. But you have to recognize that those bad things did happen, and then how to correct those bad things, or at least to acknowledge that. I mean, sometimes there's nothing we can do. They happened in the past, right? But you can't just deny that they existed or try to give only half the story.
Yeah, and it's not only that, but this whole thing with slavery and racism, it happened all of these years ago, but it still affects us to this day.
Today.
That's the thing.
It's still,
and I'll say this to wind things up, to round it off. Now I lost my thought. No, here it is. Here's what I'll say. I'll say this to round things off. You can ignore history, and that's your thing. But when you ignore such a big part of history, it's not just your thing. You're actually contributing to that ignorance that grows like a cancer in our society. And America is a great nation. It's my favorite nation. I mean, I'm an American citizen. That's my country. But it can be better. It can be so much better if we just accept our history. Don't ignore it. Don't try to whitewash it. Don't try to brush it away. Don't ignore it. Accept the history, and let's learn from it. And it's going to guide us going forward to a better unity. That's my closing sentiment. Yeah.
I would just like to make one closing sentiment, just kind of building off of that. I would like to say that you may ignore history or be ignorant of it, but history is not ignoring you. It is impacting your life every single day, from the way people perceive you to where you live, everything else. So just remember that you may not be aware of the existence of history, or you may be ignorant to it, or you don't care, but that history is affecting you. So that's all I like. That's what I'd like to end on. Quite
wisely stated by Jeff Hogue. Man, thanks for these conversations. I really appreciate you. I'm a student of history, and you are obviously a student of history as well. And you've made me a smarter person, and I hope my listeners get on board with this sentiment that, and I don't want this to be looked at as an America bashing episode. It's not that. The sentiment is that we can be a better America if we just acknowledge our history. So, Jeff, thank you so much for your contributions today.
Thank you.
And
thank you for inviting me. I'd like to come back again in the future. Obviously, there's so much more to talk about with this subject.
You are always welcome here. Like I said, if it wasn't for my dinner getting cold, we'd still be talking.
All right. Well, let me end now so you can get back to those good.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Okay.
Bye,
everybody. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you and goodbye.